Good morning and welcome to RCSD Institute 2021. Last month, September the 15th, marked the 147th anniversary of Treaty 4. This anniversary, appropriately in September, the start of our school year, reminds us that we are all treaty people for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. As someone of settler heritage on Treaty 4 territory, I am proud to work and play on these traditional lands of the Nehiyawak, the Nekaway, and the Nakota, and the homeland of Dakota, Lakota, and Métis Nation. And as we always do in Regina Catholic Schools, please join me in the sign of our faith. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, may we arise with hope for this new day. Please come and enlarge our hearts with your love. May we all feel inspired and alive today as we learn how to better know, love, and serve our students, staff, and community partners. With your Spirit flowing through us, grant us the wisdom we need to guide us as we serve our stakeholders. We give you all that we are, all our training and our knowledge. We know that without your love flowing through us, all we do and all we are nothing. Lord, come be the wind in our sails today. May we inspire each child and each other to learn and feel excited about their lives and their future. We ask this through your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, yesterday, today, and forever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, welcome everyone again. Joining us this morning for our virtual prayer and welcome are over 1,100 Regina Catholic School employees, representing 3 employee associations, 28 elementary schools, 4 high schools, and the Catholic Education Center staff, which includes education services, business and finance, human resources, information and library services, facilities, and information technology. The focus of this year's Institute is informed by the Provincial Education Interim Plan, and specifically the priority of mental health and well-being. Supervisor of Curriculum and Instruction, Shelley Chase, and the entire Student Achievement team have done a tremendous job working with staff and community partners to bring you an outstanding and robust agenda of professional development opportunities that will support and nurture not only your own well-being, but will also provide you with tips and tricks to incorporate into your daily professional and instructional practices. I wish all of you a wonderful day of learning, both virtually and face-to-face, as we continue our commitment to know, love, and serve. Enjoy the day.
We are thrilled and honored to be able to introduce our keynote speaker today. She has made such an impact and left such an influential and inspirational imprint on how we look at classroom supports and responsive instruction. Shelley Moore is from Edmonton and is now based in British Columbia. Shelley Moore is a highly sought-after teacher, researcher, consultant, and storyteller. She has worked with school districts and community organizations throughout both Canada and the United States. Her research and work has been featured at national and international conferences and is constructed based on theory and effective practices of inclusion, special education, curriculum, and teacher professional development. Her first book, entitled One Without the Other, was released in 2016 to follow up her TEDx talk hosted in Langley in January 2016. She's currently working on another much anticipated book, which should be available in the next few months. Shelley completed an undergraduate degree in special education at the University of Alberta, her master's at Simon Fraser University, and is currently a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia.
If anyone knows Shelley, she is known for her analogies and sense of humor when speaking about inclusion. Her 5 more minutes video metaphors include Dr. Big Potato, Let Them Eat Cake, Winter Tires, bowling, and many more. You may be wondering how this speaks about inclusion, and we hope it intrigues each of you to go find out more. These are just a few of the YouTube videos we highly recommend all staff watch. Shelley has a way with her metaphoric visuals that make her messages stick. She models various ways that people learn through her videos and presentations through plain language and common sense. Shelley always leaves her audience with a challenge to try a strategy and see inclusion start to magically unravel and happen before their own eyes. We feel so blessed to have Shelley speak to us today about her passionate message, and hope that each one of you takes something back with you to change the way you look at the needs in your classrooms and your students. We are so honored to have Shelley speak to our division and share her message on inclusion, equity, and diversity, and how each of us can take something back to our schools and classrooms. Shifting our mindset and teaching to all students with a universal support model and competency-based approach is imperative for all students to be successful.
Okay, friends, I am honored to be here with you today to help kick off your year. But not only just today, like we're going to be working together over time, which is like that's where the impact really comes in. So today's is our kickoff to really figure out like what the big picture is, how we're going to dig in, a chance to ask some questions and set up the stage for the sessions moving forward. I just wanted to kind of show you just some housekeeping things before we begin. This page here is where you're going to find a lot of good information. So top 3, if you're a social media person, here is all my social media: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. The bottom 2 are the websites that we're going to be using over our next few sessions together. 5moreminutes.com is it's 5moreminutes.com is my PhD procrastination project. The dissertation is hard, so instead I made a YouTube channel. So good. It's so much more fun. And so I'm sure you've heard of the 5 More Minutes, and so you can see those videos there. And Blog Some More is where I'm going to put all of the handouts over time. So today is our kickoff. So if you actually go to Blog Some More right now and go to the handouts from today are there. And those will link eventually to all of our other sessions. Everything's organized by date. And so I wanted to make that really easy. I keep that up for like 3 years. So you got so much time. The other thing I want to start with before we begin is just, before COVID, I was traveling and I was going to all of your places. But now with COVID, we've had to really become comfortable with virtual. And so what's kind of nice about that is I get to share with you the place that I'm joining you from. And so I am honored to be joining you today from the unceded ancestral and traditional territory of Squamish Nation, specifically little island off the coast of West Vancouver, Bowen Island. And I've been practicing saying how to say it in Squamish language. So Bowen Island is known as Nechwalakam, and it is the land of fast drumming. And that's so good. I love it. So my wife and I moved here about 2.5 years ago, and we used to live like right downtown Vancouver, and then we wanted a house. There's no houses to buy in Vancouver. And so we moved to Bowen Island, and it's just a 15-minute ferry. So it's really cool. So we can actually see the city. So it's kind of perfect. It's like this little rural community, but just a hop, skip, and a jump to Vancouver, which is super nice. The cool thing about Bowen Island is that Bowen Island, you can see all these little islands here. If you've ever been to Howe Sound, you know that there's tons and tons of little tiny islands. This is Gambier. This is Passage Island or Paisley Island. But they're part of the Island Trust, which is 350 islands who have unanimously engaged in reconciliation efforts. And so moving to Bowen kind of aligned with my own reconciliation journey. And so now, especially as a parent, just a sense of responsibility to acknowledge and recognize the land, but also to understand and learn about the role that the land has in our identity and in the history and the present and the future for Indigenous people. So that's my story. That's the story of where I'm from. I encourage everyone to come to Bowen. There's excellent ice cream and tacos here. You're all invited. Okay, here we go. This question here is probably the most... See, everyone has an answer to this question. You guys just talked about it, right? Like we all have an answer to this question, but what I've realized is like, we talked about this a little bit, like philosophically we align, but practically we don't align, right? Like if I were to change this and say, what does inclusion look like? Everyone will have a different answer because like schools are different, kids are different, teachers are different, families are different. Like it's impossible to make every classroom look inclusively the same. And so it's confusing. Not only that, but like our understandings of inclusion are evolving as we learn more about diversity. And I mean, so like even with the, oh my goodness, even with like the Black Lives Matter protests that have been happening in the past year, and understanding, you know, refugee situations, like we are learning more about equity. And so this has to influence our understanding of this, because it's uncovering our biases and uncovering our, like, where we sit. So I'm going to kind of walk you through how my understanding has shifted about inclusion over time. And then you can kind of figure out, like, well, where are you aligned with that, right? Were you thinking what I'm thinking? Or are you thinking totally different? Maybe you're even more evolved than me. But it's really about kind of getting on the same page so that we know what we're advocating for. If you have seen me present before, you know that I kind of like to start with this activity. Okay, so we're going to do this together. So when I first started teaching, my very first job was grade 3-4, and I taught in New York. And then I came back to Canada and I worked at a high school, so grades 8-12 in Richmond, which is just south of the Vancouver airport. And I was there for about 11 years. And I worked at a high school with students with intellectual disabilities. Okay, so when I got there, because in New York, kids with disabilities, like significant disabilities, were in a different district. Like I didn't work with them. I worked with kids in an inclusive school, but with kids with high incidence disabilities, right? So there was always like this, okay, yeah, we're inclusive, but there's still kids who are missing. So when I came back to Canada and I see the school that has all of these kids in the same school, I was like, okay, this is better. But when I went to go find my classroom in my new school, I realized, well, I mean, but we were behind 3 sets of double doors. Like we were there, but no one knew we were there. And so I had about between 16 and 18 students with significant disabilities. And so I was at that school for 7 years. And so it really was this journey of like, what does inclusion look like for them? Because when I got there, they were in some phys ed classes and a couple of like grade 8 classes, but they were no academics. They ate lunch separate. They arrived later. They came into a separate entrance in the school. Like they were very, very separate. And so over time, we were trying to figure out as a school, what does this look like? You know, because elementary is better, but high school, often kids go into life skills programs, which is what was happening. But I'm like, these kids are just more capable of this. And I would love to tell you that this went smoothly. It didn't at all. Because this is the thing, is that the teachers that I was working with, like, for a long time, I thought they were protesting inclusion because they were like, no, these kids can't be here. But then I realized over time, I'm like, it's not that people don't want kids in their classroom. It's that they have no idea what to do. How do you make physics 11 meaningful for someone who's going to university and someone who has Down syndrome? I wasn't taught how to do that. The physics teacher wasn't taught how to do that. And here's the secret. We're just like kids. If we don't know what to do, we push back and we show challenging behavior, right? And so that's what was happening. So it took me a long time to realize that it's not that people disagree. It's not that they don't want kids in their classroom. It's just that we don't know how to do it. And the only solution that we've been taught is to have an EA, to have a support staff. And support staff are really important, don't get me wrong. But then it's put a lot of pressure on support staff to do a lot of things that aren't actually their role. And so it's increased workload for teachers. It's increased workload for paras. It's increased workload for support teachers. Like it's just, it's really hard. And when things are hard, we push back. And so part of our journey at our own school was trying to figure out not just how do we manage this difficult process, but how do we make this easier on ourselves, right? And so people say that I say this is my favorite tagline, and not everyone believes me, but I really believe this. It's like, first we have to understand that inclusion, it's not more work. It can't be more work. No one has time for more work, but we have to acknowledge that it is different work than what we know. I mean, I grew up in Alberta. There were no kids with intellectual disabilities in my classes, right? I mean, I know they were in the school. I don't know where. Like, we have to acknowledge that we didn't grow up this way. We weren't taught to teach this way. And so understanding that we can philosophically agree with this, and it's okay that we don't know what to do. That's why we're together. That's why we're together. And so when we were in our school, we kind of went on a little journey to figure out how to do this. And one of the first things we had to do was be on the same page about what we were trying to do. Okay. So we had a little committee in our school, a little high school. We had a little committee of people who wanted to like increase inclusion, not just for kids with intellectual disabilities, but we had like all of these programs. We had a behavior program. We had a learning disabilities program. We had like a behavior program like that. Like over 30% of the school was in programs. If 30% of your school is in programs, it's not the kids that are the problem, right? Something has to change in the restructuring of the school, right? So we went on a journey and we started to do some research and dig into some literature, but like, what does inclusion look like? And in our investigation, there were these words that kept coming up, and like, we know what these words mean, but we had a hard time figuring out how they were different from each other. So like, what's the difference between exclusion and segregation? What's the difference between integration and segregation? And so this is where we realized we got stuck. So we're going to do this together. Okay. If you're in the chat box, just answer in the chat box. If you're in person, just talk to your neighbor. Okay. So here are some diagrams. So take a look at these diagrams. I'm going to say a word and you're going to tell me which diagram you think goes with each word. Okay. So tell me, either talk to your neighbor in the chat box. Say, which diagram do you think is exclusion? Which diagram do you think is exclusion? What do you think? A, okay, so the chat box says A, D, A or D. Okay, what are you guys saying in person? Dream team, talk to me. A, okay. And so this is often what happens. Like, we know that exclusion is out, right? But A and D are both out. But what's the difference between the two, right? Okay. Which one do you think is integration? What do you think? Integration. B, C. Okay, so we have a B and we have a C. Again, this is what happens, right? We know that integration is in. So is that B or is that C? And you can see why this gets tricky, because if we're all in the same school, if we're in the same class, and I say that I want to be inclusive, but you think inclusive looks like B, and other people think inclusion looks like C, those are two totally different scenarios, right? So like, how do we get on the same page? Friends, I've never had consensus. Not once. I do this activity all the time. Like, what does that tell you, right? We think we know, but we don't know. Okay, you want to see the answers? Yes, Shelley. Okay, here we go. So here are the answers. Take a look. Give yourself a high five if you got them right. Okay, so these, I didn't make these diagrams. A lot of people think I did. I didn't make these. I just adapted them. I tried to find the person who created these unsuccessfully. Like, oh my goodness, I emailed people all over the world. I'm like, did you make these? They're like, no. So then I tried to find someone or an organization that uses them that's really valid. So, and I did. So like the UN uses this, but they don't use it for disability. They use it for marginalized populations. And so that's interesting though, because you could look at this through the lens of disability, but you could also look at this through the lens of women. You could look at this through the lens of Black people. You could look at this through the lens of queer people. Like, there's always this kind of status quo group, and then there's this other group that we're trying to figure out what to do with, right? But when I first saw this diagram, the concept that really stood out to me was this one, segregation, because I know what segregation is, because when I say the word segregation, the period of history that I'm reminded of is civil rights movement, right? Like race relations in the States with North America. I think about residential schools. I think about apartheid. I think about World War II. Like, I think about all of these events in history. And what they all have in common is there's a group of people who are forced apart. But there's no choice. There's no choice. There's no like, I want to go there, because the decision is made by someone who's not a part of that community. Okay. Now it's important to clarify this, because there are communities that aren't forced apart. They choose to be apart. That's not segregation. So for example, the deaf community. Okay. The deaf community has come together as a community and said, we want to be together. We want to learn together. We want to be in a community together. That's not segregation because they're choosing to be a part of that. It's an identity community. That's congregation, like a church. You choose your congregation. All of us are a part of a congregated community, whether that is, oh my goodness, a cultural community, a language community. If you have girls' night out, that's a congregated community. It's where you find other people with like identities, like religious community, language, like we're all a part of this, okay? And I do believe that there can be a disability community that comes together in a way that's congregated. I think that there's a place for that. I don't think there's a place for the opposite, which is I'm not a deaf person. And I'm saying to a deaf person, oh, you're deaf, you go over there. Where there's no choice and the separation and the movement is being decided by someone who's not in that community. This is so important because if there's no choice in the matter, it can never be congregation, okay? All right, so if segregation is separation by group, exclusion is separation by individual. So when I think about exclusion, I think about like kids on the playground. Okay, so like one kid says to another kid, you can't play with us. They're excluding them. Okay, now here's the most important part of today. If this is all you remember, I'll be happy. If exclusion and segregation are forced separation, integration is the opposite. It's forced togetherness. Can you think of a time? I hope it's not today. When I think of forced togetherness, I always think of like staff meetings. When I was school-based, our staff meetings were on the first Monday of the month, and they felt like they were so long. They were like from like 3 to 4:30. Like they were long, but they felt like they were hours. And no one wants to go to a staff meeting because every time you go to a staff meeting, you're like, why isn't this an email? Right? So we go there and you're tired, you're hungry, it's Monday, you're like, I don't want to be here, but we have to go. You have to go to your staff meetings. And so we have strategies to get through. So the first strategy we use is that we find our people, we congregate. And you can see this, especially in high schools. The English department sits together, the phys ed department sits together, the special education department sits together, the administrators sit together. You know what's probably happening today? And all your little like groups are just like, yeah, phys ed over here, social studies over here. We go find our people, right? We congregate. It's a strategy when we have to be somewhere, and that's the only criteria. The other thing we do, this is what I did, is if I'm just like in a place because I have to be, I find my people, but then I distract myself. I do other things. I make my own purpose. So I started actually to really like staff meetings because I got really purposeful. I got really productive. I would do all my emails during my staff meetings. I'd get so much done. I'd be like, yeah, I love staff meetings. Until it was caught on that other people were doing the same thing. So our admin was just like, no more computers. And I'm like, so then I had to go back. So now not only am I forced to be there, I'm being forced to listen. Torture. So then I'm like, they can't take my phone. So now I'm playing Candy Crush and shopping on Amazon. What's happening? I am displaying challenging behavior. I am not following the instructions or the rules. I am pushing back because you guys, just physically being together is not enough. Just being forced somewhere to exist because you have to, it's not enough for me. It's not enough for you. It's not enough for kids. And so if you think about this, when we started to like talk about inclusion, this is probably the biggest misunderstanding, was that inclusion is we're just going to put all the kids with disabilities in classrooms. Done. Put them in, close the door. And I want you to imagine, because even in segregated communities, you can have a community. We've taken away the only community that kids know. We're putting them in classrooms with kids they don't know, and they don't know why they're there. They think the only reason why we're there is because they have to. And even if they wanted to play Candy Crush and shop on Amazon, we wouldn't let them. And so this is why probably one of the biggest symptoms of the inclusive movement is challenging behavior and anxiety, not because inclusion is not working, but because we're not being inclusive, we're being integrative, where we're putting kids together into a shared container. But that is the only criteria, is shared space and time. That is not enough for anybody. And so what's been happening is all this behavior and anxiety is popping up, and people are like, inclusion's not working. We got to go back. We got to go back to segregation. I guess they're choosing segregation. Let's recall it congregation. No, friends, if inclusion's not working, it's because it's not inclusion, right? We have to think about integration as the container. Inclusion is the community. We start with integration, but we can't stay there. We're going to move backwards. We got to keep moving. So what's the difference then between inclusion and these bottom three? So these bottom three, what they all have in common is that it's a forced movement. We can force kids together and apart all we want. We do it all the time. That's not the goal, okay? The goal is that kids not only exist together, but they actually are part of a community together. But you can't force a community. This is the part this is why this is tricky. You can't force that. You have to build it with the people in the community. You have to co-construct it by the kids in that community. You have to build it. Now we know this, but then it's thinking about how do we actually create communities where kids don't just exist, but they have that sense of belonging and contribution so that they don't want to have challenging behavior because they don't want to leave, where kids miss them, where they're like, this is where I belong, right? So, but the reason why this is hard is because you can't force it and it doesn't look the same to every classroom, right? Like you can't standardize this. And so the conversations that we're going to be having is how do we move from, like a lot of people understand it's hard to be inclusive when you're physically apart. So, okay, so let's get people physically together. But then what? What do we do to move from a container where we exist to a community where we belong? Capital B. Oh, okay. I'm going to pause. So I've already told you about my procrastination project, the 5 more minutes. And so the very first 5 more minutes video I did was about, hold on. The very first 5 more minutes I did was about these dots. Okay, so I'm going to show you this video. If you've seen this video, you have absolute permission to check your email and play Candy Crush. Okay. But I want to show this to you because I actually even would show this to kids and to parents to say, hey, let's have a conversation so that we're on the same page about what we're doing. Okay, let me just share my screen. Here we go. So many windows. Okay, here we go. Share, big. Okay, volume up. All right, go. Oh, you can't hear. Videos in 5 minutes or welcome to 5 more minutes. Useful videos in 5 minutes or less that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelley Moore. Today's topic is the evolution of inclusion. Okay, so you remember the dots? I know. I've shown you these before. But one colleague of mine suggested to me once, he goes, what if we didn't look at these as different concepts that we compare to each other, but instead as an evolution of time? It was totally brilliant. Now we can look at this timeline through the lens of any marginalized population, but to understand this timeline from the inclusion and disability perspective, we have to go back in time a little bit. Many of us know or are connected to someone who experienced institutionalization. It was even recommended to families by doctors. Although British Columbia was the first province in Canada to close down their institutions, there are still individuals living in these conditions across Canada today. The institutionalization movement is an example of exclusion. It separated individuals with disabilities from their families without choice. But the disability rights movement over the past 50 years, with the hard work of some incredible self-advocates and families, and maybe a little help from Geraldo Rivera, pushed communities to shift so that individuals of all abilities were welcomed and living in the same settings as their family and friends. This shift from institutions to communities, this was the start of the inclusive evolution. We have movement, but can we do better? Although many individuals are no longer excluded from their families and communities, they were, and let's be honest, they still are, expected to attend segregated schools or self-contained special education programs that are totally separate from the rest of the school community. And so parents started to ask some very good questions. You see, children with disabilities have siblings without disabilities, and families wanted all their kids to have equitable access to community-based education together. Kids started to be integrated into classrooms with their peers. They're in math together. They're in gym class together. They're eating lunch together. Kids are together. This is better. The shift from segregated to integrated schools and classrooms, this is the next step in the evolution of inclusion. We have movement, but can we do better? Well, this is where things get tricky, because integration, it doesn't take long to realize that just being together, it's not enough. Although in the same classroom, students with disabilities are often just that. They're physically in the classroom. They may sometimes have parallel activities, but mostly it's loosely connected classroom tasks. Now, you don't need me to tell you that just physically sharing space and time is enough to make you feel like you belong in a community. I mean, come on, there are Disney movies made about this. Breathing the same air is not enough. Do you remember the Titans? I do. The evolution from integration to inclusion is now the topic of many conversations in communities and schools around the world. How do we support individuals to be meaningfully included and not just physically integrated? It's not just about where kids go in their day, but why. What is the purpose to the places that they go? It's now school-based teams and staff that are asking questions about how to do this. How can we support purposeful and meaningful placements for kids with disabilities? In inclusive classrooms and schools, students aren't just present, but they have roles and responsibilities in their classrooms and also meaningfully connecting to their peers. This is inclusion. So there you have it, my friends. A brief history of inclusion in about 5 minutes. If this is interesting to you, though, definitely investigate your local history as well, because every community is in a different place in this journey, and it's so valuable to know where we've come from. The other thing, though, is looking at these visuals as a timeline. It really helped me to shift my own thinking from which bubble am I at or not at, and shift to more about where are we now in our inclusive journey and what's our next step. All of a sudden, the goal of inclusion becomes action-oriented and just feels so much more possible. We may not all be at the same place in the journey, but we can all move forward. We can do better. And so this is the question I'm going to leave you with today. Can we still do better? Do you think there's another evolution in inclusion? What might that be? How can we inch even more forward to make inclusion happen? Thanks, Geraldo. Do you guys know Geraldo's connection to this? I'm going to tell you anyway. So Geraldo Rivera. If you don't know who Geraldo is, you got to do some Googling. But Geraldo Rivera had a very big role in all of this, because when he, like in the 70s, he's like looking for a big story, trying to make it in the world of journalism. And he finds a big story. He discovers hears about Willowbrook, bribes a security guard and sneaks in a camera and exposes the institution in New York, and made a documentary, wins the Peabody Award, and just kind of like it created a whole bunch of attention to the self-advocates and families, as the video says, to expose this institutional life. And of course, people are like, whoa, what do you mean this is happening? Because it's awful, trigger warning. And it caused a huge shift in resources from institutions to community organizations. And so, like in Alberta, it used to be community living, and now it's Inclusion Alberta. That's where it came from, right? Was that kind of like huge shift to understand that we need to support our communities. This isn't about sending our kids into these like institutions that are awful, right? So kudos. Not a lot of people know, because like he didn't like maintain that rigor over his career, but to each their own. So I got to tell you what happened about this evolution, because when I first started, this is what I thought inclusion was. Like, how do I include people with disabilities in my class, right? Like even these questions are coming out that way, right? What do I do with those kids who have like challenging behavior? What do I do with these kids that have different needs than these kids? Like really thinking about the kids that aren't fitting. And then I have to tell you what happened. I was teaching a course at UBC. Every person in my class is a teacher. Okay, so they're all in a master's program. graduate program. So they all have classrooms. And I put up this diagram, and one of my teacher, like, she like groans. She's like, I hate this slide. I'm like, what do you mean you hate this slide? This is a great slide. She's like, no, I totally disagree with you. She's like, none of these are inclusion. I'm like, what do you mean? Her name's Julie. We're still friends today. Because listen to what she says. She's like, this none of these are inclusion. Let's look what you're showing us. You're showing us 4 bubbles, right? And there's like a majority status quo student, those green kids. And then there's these non-green kids that we're trying to figure out what to do with, and they don't fit with the green kids. And so like, yeah, we're trying to include these non-green kids, but what the reality is that these red kids are attached to red teachers, and the blue kids are attached to blue teachers, and the yellow kids are attached to yellow teachers. And yeah, they're like in my class, but all of them have an IEP that's trying to make them green. It's like, how do we fix them so that they fit? How do we change them so that they fit into this community of like sameness? She's like, if we're trying to change kids, that's not inclusion, that's assimilation. And I'm like, wow, you can pass my class. And you realize that all of these diagrams are aligned to the special education model, which is there are kids who aren't green. There are kids who are not green, and we all went to school thinking that the goal is for everyone to be green. Special education, friends, evolved out of the medical model. You go to the doctor when something's wrong. You break your leg, you go to the doctor. They fixed you. If they can't fix you, they send you to a specialist. Like, does this sound familiar? This is what we're doing to kids. We're like, oh, you can't behave. You need to be fixed. You can't learn. We need to be fixed, right? This is really problematic, friends. This is a really problematic way to view kids. First of all, our classrooms are looking less and less like this. There's less, as our classrooms get more diverse, there's less green students. And so then we're panicking because we're like, oh my goodness, we need so many resources to make all of these kids green. But like, there's some kids that will never be green, ever. Never. But it doesn't mean they're not going to be successful and find happiness in the world. In fact, probably the most successful people you know are people who didn't fit in the box, right? And so you look at this and we're like, okay, so like, what's the problem with all of these diagrams is something called othering. You may have heard of it before. Othering is when we go say things like this, those kids, your kids, these kids. We separate a group of people because they're different. And when we do that, those people, when we say those people, we're communicating that those people are less than, that they're different, they're weird, and they're scary. And whenever I talk about othering, I think about growing up as a young queer person growing up in a very religious community, where whenever anything gay came up, everyone around me talked about gay people as weird, different, and scary, and to stay away from them. But like, knowing myself that I'm gay, I'm like, I'm not weird, different, or scary. And it was really problematic. And so now if you think about kids with disabilities, how we talk about them as those kids are taking away the learning of others. Those kids are putting other kids in jeopardy. We're hearing this. Think about that as an identity forming thing to hear. Kids with disabilities, right? They're not going to behave for you. They're not going to engage for you. Like, we have to stop othering. But the only way that we can stop othering is if we actually stop and recognize that our classrooms don't look like this. Our classrooms look like this. There's no more those kids. There's no more green kids. I mean, you're starting your school year. Oh my goodness. One thing I hear people say all the time, oh, the kids are changing. They're not like they used to be. Yeah, that's great. That's great that our classrooms are getting more diverse, because guess what? This is what the world looks like. This is what IKEA looks like. This is what the grocery store looks like. This is what your staff looks like. This is what your families look like. The goal is not to become the same. The goal is, how do I navigate difference? That's the skill. But as teachers, we look at this and we have panic attacks, because now I look at this classroom and I'm like, oh, I need 29 individual education plans and I need 25 EAs, because we still think that the goal is to make all of these kids the same. They have to be standard. They all have to be green. And if we think that the goal is for all of these kids to be green, that workload is impossible. Nobody gets paid enough to do this, even in Alberta, and you get paid more. Nobody gets paid enough to teach a class like this, where the goal is to make them all the same. But we have to also acknowledge that we can say that and be like, yeah, that sounds great, but how do you do that? I wasn't taught I don't know how to teach a class like this, and where the goal isn't to be the same. We all grew up, like I grew up in Alberta, everyone grew up according to standardized exams. And in fact, like you still have the standardized exams. So how do I teach this and negotiate standardized curriculum? I didn't know how to do that. It's okay that you don't know, but we have to acknowledge that this is different. Like these conditions are different than how we grew up, than how we were taught to teach. And so we have to take a step back and be okay with not knowing, and we have to take a step back and be like, I need to learn more. I need to try new things. I need to evolve my practice, because if we continue to try and teach how we were taught to teach to kids that look like this, we're going to have to retire at 45 or go on stress leave, because kids will never become homogenized. They will never all be green. But it also comes back to that. This is why we go back to that sorting. Oh, we have to put the red kids over here and the blue kids over here so that I can have these green kids. Well, we don't have the resources for class sizes of 7, right? Plus, it's actually really, it's not good for kids to only be with homogenous groupings, because that's not what the world is like. Kids have to navigate this, right? And so this is why I love that we're doing a series, because we're not just talking about this. We're actually going to dig into this and be like, how do I do this? But we first have to acknowledge that we have to shift what we do. We have to change how we teach. We have to change how we plan. We have to change how we structure. We cannot do what we've always done. And if that's what you walk away with today, we are ready to move forward. Because if we're trying to change these kids to all become the same, we are going to think inclusion is hard work forever. Where are you? Where are you thinking? Are we thinking that inclusion is still including people with disabilities? Or is inclusion teaching to diversity that includes disability, but also includes all of the things that make us diverse: gender, culture, language, race, religion, all of the things that make us diverse? The goal is not to change them. The goal is to help kids find their color. The goal is to help them to be brighter. The goal is to help them learn from each other. The goal is for everyone to be a teacher. Where's the textbook for that? So moving forward, this I thought was my definition for a long time. So instead of saying, how do we include kids with disabilities, to how do we teach to diversity that includes all of us, all of our diverse kids and teachers and staff and parents. And then I showed that video that I just showed you on the internet, and at the end it says, what do you think the next evolution is? And I'd love to tell you that that was rhetorical, but nothing on the internet is rhetorical. So I get a whole bunch of emails back, and the emails are like, Shelley, no. All of these dots are the same size. They need to be different sizes. And so this mom, she's like, my son is a little person. One of those dots should be smaller. And I'm like, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. Another person was like, Shelley, no. What about virtual communities? Like, these should be dotted lines or overlapping Venn diagrams. And I'm like, sure, why not? Virtual communities, what? You do you. The next person was just like, Shelley, this is just one bubble. You can't just feel like you belong in one community. That's like a default. We got to have at least 4. I'm like, my slide isn't big enough. So I have to show you, this is in honor of the feedback, right? Like, how would you evolve this? I've heard they need to be different shapes. I've heard that they should be overlapping. I've heard that, oh my goodness, so many different, that they should be 3-dimensional. And it's all of them are correct, because the idea that we're getting at here is that these dots are so different from each other. The more different they are from each other, the more like, the more accurate and authentic it is. Even if kids look the same, they're different. There's going to be some part of difference. So then how are they different? So then someone says to me, Shelley, this stresses me out. I'm not one color. I'm not one identity. Like, I'm multiple identities. Where's the intersectionality? And I'm like, I'm quitting. So I was thinking about this on my way home on the flight from presentation, and I was like, okay, what about this? What about all of us are little Trivial Pursuit pies? Look at this. And so the different colors represent the different communities that we're a part of. So then I found this on the internet. It's called the identity wheel. And I mean, there's more nuance than how it's described, but like, I want you to look at this from your perspective. Like, what communities are you a part of, right? Like, do you have a cultural community? Do you have an educational community? Do you have a work community? Do you have a religious community? Like, all of us are going to start connecting to colors that are connected to who we are, right? But also understanding that our colors will change over time. So for example, before I was a parent, well, really before I was an adult, like my friendship community was everything, right? But now that I have a family, my family community is really, really big, right? But I have, oh my gosh, I have a work community, I have an education community, I have a political community, I have a queer community. So I mean, like, you look at this and you say, like, who am I? What am I? And so if you look at this, like, what colors stand out for you, right? Now, this is where we're at now, because we're just like, okay. Well, what if then inclusion is twofold? The first one is, how do we find connection with other people who share an identity with us for that congregation? And how do we find ways to navigate settings where people have different colors than us? Okay, so for example, here's a true story. This happened in Alberta. A little guy, 7 years old, grade 2, refugee, new arrival to Canada, did not have a lot of English, okay? And hadn't actually had a lot of formal schooling. Arrives to Canada, arrives to Alberta in the middle of winter. Can you imagine? He's probably like, what is this place? It's like Cool Runnings. Like, what is this place? And so on the first couple of days, he goes on the playground and he's for recess and he's just like, what is this place? What are these kids doing? And so he's looking a little stressed, like, what do I do? So his teacher sees him and starts to walk up towards him to be like, hey, like, it's okay. This is recess, right? And as she's walking up towards him, she notices his face totally changes and he gets really excited and he bolts. And she's like, great, we got a runner. She watches him. And what she realized happened was that little guy heard someone speaking his home language. And they came together like magnets. And so what happened there was this little guy found someone else who was his color. Found someone just be like, oh my goodness, you're the same as me. There's a place for that in school. Oh my goodness, is there ever a place for that in school? A place for kids to come together because they're the same? Oh my goodness, absolutely. But the kids are deciding that, not us. So we have to create these opportunities. Now, the other thing that inclusion is looking at, oh, look, there's people who are different than me. So let me hypothetically, let's say that I'm purple and so you're pink. We're going to share space together. We have grown up thinking that if I'm purple and you're pink, I need to make you purple and you need to make me pink. Especially if the purple is the status quo, then we're like, you need to be like us, right? That's not inclusion, that's assimilation. Inclusion is, I'm purple and you're pink. How do I learn from your pinkness? How do you learn from my purpleness? The goal isn't to change each other. The goal is to learn from each other. But then I started thinking about this and I'm like, well, schools don't do either of this. You know what schools do? Schools organize kids by a lack of color. So for example, you can't speak English, go over there. You can't behave, go over there. You can't learn, go over there. You can't regulate, go over there. We do the opposite of these things. We organize kids by their deficits, not by their strengths, interests, or their identities. And the problem with this, perfect example for English language learners, if you want to learn a new language, the way to learn a new language is to immerse yourself with people who have a strength in that language. Okay, so like, if I want to learn Danish, the best way is to go to Denmark and be surrounded by other people who speak Danish, okay? But what we do in school is the opposite. We put all the kids who can't speak English together to speak English. Like, it's completely backwards. So now think about this. What if we said the same thing about behavior? instead of putting all the kids who have a hard time with behavior in the same room to get better at behavior, why don't we put them around kids who have a strength in behavior, who have a strength in regulation? My favorite one is, let's put all the kids who have anxiety together to not have anxiety, to talk about anxiety so they don't have anxiety, or to go around people who have a strength in emotions and confidence, right? If we are in communities organized by strength and interests, everybody's a teacher. But if we continue to organize kids by things they can't do, the only teacher is the teacher. And you don't need me to tell you how hard it is to staff behavior programs, anxiety programs, because that workload for that one person is so high. It's so high. So this is turning everything completely upside down. This is changing how we look at kids, because our go-to, this medical model, something's wrong with you, you need to go get fixed. Something, you can't do this, you need to go, you need to get fixed. Friends, it's never going to work. So now I'm thinking to myself, okay, so what is inclusion? I started off thinking inclusion was, well, how do we include people who are different? To shifting to, well, how do I teach to diversity? Well, like, we can't teach to diversity unless not only do we know who the kids are, but the kids know who they are. They know who their strengths, they know their interests, they know who they are, so they can learn from each other. But I'll tell you, because we've done this, you ask kids who they are, they don't know. You ask them what they're good at, they don't know. Especially the kids that struggle. But if you ask them what they're not good at, they will tell you a whole long list, because that's what we value. That's what special education values, is what kids can't do. So this is going to take teaching. This is going to take time. We are changing the narrative for how we view kids. Who are you? What are your strengths? What can you do? Rather than organizing kids by what they're not. I could go on. Okay. All right, here we go. So thinking about this now, this idea of identity, we're on the same page now about kind of like what it is. You've already told me that you understand why it's important. Where we're really going to head now for today and the rest of our series is really looking at how do we do this in not just an effective way, because we know inclusion is effective, but in an efficient way. And so this is really looking at the resources that we're using. A lot of times the resources that we're using are being used to support segregation in self-contained settings. And so part of this is starting to make steps to say, how do we reallocate resources to be used in more optimal ways, but also in ways that people feel supported, okay? And so this is what we're going to talk about next, and this kind of leads me to the research I'm doing for my PhD, which is, how do we make this easier? Okay, and we talked about this. Like, how do we make inclusion so that people choose it because it's easier, not because they have to do it? And so, you know, me and my metaphors, right? What can we compare this to? Now, as you know, I'm from Alberta, grew up in Alberta. And so this is my next video I'm going to show you is, how do we think about inclusion? It doesn't matter if you're a teacher, just in general, in a whole school community. How do we think about our kids, each other, our families, from a perspective of an infrastructural condition as opposed to just a belief system, okay? Big screen, closed captions, play.
Welcome to 5 more minutes, useful videos in about 5 minutes that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelley Moore. Today's episode is called Compost Gate Saves the Earth. Okay, full disclaimer, the story I'm about to tell you, I am not proud of. You see, I grew up in the 80s, and I grew up in Alberta. And although I remember learning about the 4 Rs, I can't honestly tell you that I lived the 4 hours. Of course, we all know that it's important to save the earth, but I honestly don't remember a blue recycle bin in my classroom until at least junior high school. I mean, if there was a recycle bin close by, I would use it, of course. I mean, I wasn't a recycling jerk, but it had to be easy. I wasn't going too far out of my way to save the bottle from the can. And then I moved to British Columbia. Now, if you don't know about the Pacific Northwest, there's actually 5 R's, not 4. Recycle, reduce, reuse, recover, religion. They have commercials that actually guilt you into recycling by threatening the impact of non-recycling karma, and they have garbage cans that look like this. I didn't understand the full extent of the pressure, however, until one night when I had a small get-together with a few friends, and all of a sudden, my friend, let's call her Kate, she stops the party. She pulls a Corona bottle out of the garbage can and yells across the room, "What is this?" To which I replied, "Garbage?" Kate politely but firmly replied, "Shelley Moore, if you plan on having any friends in British Columbia, this behavior is not a possibility." Upon her next visit, Kate shows up at my door with my first recycle bin, bright blue, for my bottles. And after I ran out of all possible excuses to not do it, I found myself recycling bottles and paper so that I could maintain my friendships. So I'm feeling pretty good about myself. I mean, I'm practically David Suzuki. And then she drops the C-bomb. "Shelley," she says, "have you ever thought about composting?" Oh, no. This is where I draw the line. Absolutely not. I live in an apartment. I don't have a garden. I don't have a place to take it. I'm from Alberta. We're born with a rat aversion. "Compost smells. You can keep it in the freezer," she says. Compost, Kate, the freezer is for delicious popsicles. So my compost bin sat stubbornly empty for months, and I avoided both it and the smell of rotting bananas. But then I moved to another building, and this time, guess what was in the recycling room? A compost bin. But not only that, the room had this time-censored lavender mist spritzer. Okay, now we're talking. Now I can compost. And all of a sudden, I had all the supports I needed to finally declare myself a recycler. So how did I become a recycler? I definitely needed Compost Kate. For sure. She was knowledgeable, she had patience and support to challenge me, to move me forward, even though I started nowhere close to her level of acceptability. Kate is passionate about recycling. The world needs Compost Kates. But Compost Kate was not all that I needed to become a recycler. And actually, if you look at the movement of saving the earth, the Compost Kates are not the ones who create the shift. They might be the catalyst, but what we really need are the structural supports to get the non-recyclers to become recyclers. That's how change happens. It was the bins, the visual, the elevator, the education, the space, the bottle refund, the compost bin, the lavender spritzer. These were the supports that shifted me to change, the supports that made it easier to recycle. But here's the thing, none of these supports were people. In inclusive classrooms, the #1 request I hear is for more people. No, don't get me wrong. We always will need our inclusion Kates. These are the people who will go out of their way to include. They have the knowledge and the vision to teach the rest of us, but they alone are not enough to tip the scale. Reality is that the biggest shift to inclusive teachings comes from the structural supports in the school and the community. These supports make it so that choosing inclusion is easier, not just better. The other thing to also remember is that this is not a destination. You know what Compost Kate said to me the other day? "Shelley, you need to stop recycling and start reducing and reusing more. Just when you think you've arrived, there's a new evolution of progress." Inclusion is a mindset of growth and movement, something that we are always striving to get better at, but also advocating for the structures and supports to help us to make the shift. I truly believe that we know why inclusion is important, just like we know why it's important to save the planet. But in our advocacy aimed at support for inclusion, it's the systemic structures of support that we need to ask for, not just more people. So here's the challenge for today. What recycle bins and inclusive structures are already in place in your classroom, school, district, or community? Who are your inclusion Kates? And how can we make sure that they feel appreciated? And what could be your lavender spritzer? What structures are still needed to make inclusion easier. Make it easy, make it better, because people will always choose better when it's easy. So I know one support that we already have is each other. So let's connect. You can find us.
I'll save you the promo. Okay, so here it is. How do we make this easy? This has to be easy.
All over the place. YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. So make sure you like and subscribe.
Stop talking. Okay, there we go. Let's just get her out of here. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is where we're moving. This is going to be our goal for the year. Is I'm going to show you some infrastructural shifts that we can make. But here's what I'm going to tell you is this doesn't. You don't have to do exactly as I say. That's not the goal. The goal is not to replicate this. The goal is for you as a community to come together and say what makes sense for us, okay? This is our big question. All of you, I want you to see yourselves as leaders, okay? So this is the garbage can at UBC. And every time you come up with a piece of garbage, you press the button and this pops up and it says, stop, is that really garbage? Like, honestly, it is in your face all the time, right? But I love this because now I think like every decision we make as a leader, because I'm telling every single one of you are leaders, every single one of you are teachers. Every single decision that you make every day, I want you to imagine this pop-up sign and say, stop, wait! Is that inclusion? Is that inclusive? Because if we start to kind of like reflect on these individual decisions over time, it's going to be easier to say, how do I reallocate resources to be more inclusive, to be choosing inclusive, to be implementing inclusion? Okay. My baby just arrived for you to say hi. Here she is.
Still in her pajamas.
Tell everyone, go inclusion, go. Woo! This is Meta. She slept for like 9 hours last night. Isn't that amazing? You're amazing. You're amazing. So that's actually really good timing, honey, because we are wrapping up.
Perfect.
So good.
Job,
okay, friends. I want to thank you so much for spending your morning with me. As we wrap this up, here is the question that I want you to really think about is, because we're going to be seeing each other again, what's going to be the thing that you hold on to when we see each other next? It's okay that you don't know what to do, but what's one thing you want to hold on to really think about, something you want to try, something you want to talk to others about, so that when we come back together, we are ready to jump in, we are ready to dig in. I know sometimes these are hard conversations, but that's okay because that's where the work is. The work is in the hard conversations. The growth is in the dissonance. All of us are growing right now. We are navigating diversity, equity, inclusion, and COVID. This is hard, so let's stick together and do this. I want to thank you so much. All of these slides, you guys, all of these slides are on my website. They are here for you. When we come back together, we're going to dig in. We're going to look at, we're going to do the work. We're going to do it.
Thank you, Shelley. I cannot express how happy I am that we all have had the opportunity today to listen to Shelley's messages regarding inclusion, equity, and diversity. I am also very, very happy that we have had the pleasure to experience Shelley's vibrant, authentic personality and gushing passion for supporting all students, their families, and communities. I have been blessed many times having experienced Shelley's work in advocacy through her 5 More Minute videos, PD sessions, and planning meetings. Every experience challenges me to unlearn as well as to learn, challenging my current beliefs and practices as well as supporting new perspectives and an urgency to implement effective practical strategies. Additionally, every experience has been a delight. I have giggled and laughed and felt validated. Shelley is so good for one's own mental health. As educators, we know that relationship is the base and necessary ingredient of all attempts to assist learning and create change. Shelley is a great educator. She models and lives this educational must. Shelley's enthusiasm is contagious, and my hope is that she has gifted each one of you with at least a smidge of this enthusiasm, hopefully more, that will carry forward in your interactions with all RCSD students and families. Please stay tuned. There will definitely be more, Shelley, more, encounters and opportunities in the future. Please take some time to check out her short educational videos and her website, 5moreminutes.com. I wish you all a great day of learning, connection, and positivity.